USCHO.com. This is the USCHO Game of the Week podcast from US College Hockey Online at USCHO.com. An in-depth look at this week's top college hockey matchup and a preview of the other big games.
Welcome to the USCHO Game of the Week podcast for Thursday, October 21st, 2021. I'm Ed Trefzger alongside Jim Connelly. Jim, there's a two-game series this weekend at Quinnipiac as North Dakota travels there. That may be the best East-West matchup of the season.
And joining us now on the USCHO Game of the Week podcast, the longtime scribe beat writer for the Grand Forks Herald, that's Brad Schlossman. And Brad, we say it's been a long time, but you've been covering this team for a while, and this is a pretty interesting team this year. They seem to have a lot of good things in their mix, and obviously the excitement up in that Grand Forks area to have hockey and fans back in the building is certainly palpable.
Yeah, it's been a weird year and a half, 2 years, I suppose you could say, just with the pandemic and all the changes. And, this year is definitely different in the sense that UND lost over half of its team from last year. Over 50% of its roster is gone. And you rarely see that in college hockey. And the second thing you rarely see is UND picked up 5 transfers in 1 year. The previous 19 years combined, they had 5 transfers. And now they did that in like a month or a month and a half. So very atypical. I think A, part of it was the explosion of players in the transfer portal. B, I don't think you want to bring in 14 freshmen. That's real tough in college hockey to win with that many freshmen. And on top of that, I think the other risk you run is now setting up a cycle where every 4 years you have to replace half your roster. I think if you remember Wisconsin about 10 years ago, they got in that cycle. They were having these massive freshman classes. They'd struggle for 2 years. They'd kind of be decent for that third year, and then they'd be great the fourth year and get to the tournament. And then boom, all of a sudden 2 years, they'd be down again. And I don't think UND wanted to start, that type of a cycle. And here you had all these players in the portal. And so you got a bunch of new faces. You got some transfers who are maybe familiar faces to people in college hockey. You got fans back in the building, which certainly I question whether they be able to get fans back in the building like they used to. And that goes for every sport in North America. I wondered, are fans going to get used to sitting at home and watching on TV and not standing in line at the bathroom and grabbing a beer out of their fridge for $2 instead of whatever it costs at that venue? And so I was like, oh man, this might be tough on sports. But, the first exhibition game here, they sold it out and had, more people than they've ever had for an exhibition game at North Dakota. So that tells me it's the other way around. Maybe people wanted to get out.
More than 11,800 fans for that game against Bemidji State. And Brad, maybe you can take us through. You can start with that exhibition if you'd like, but, a sweep of Niagara to start the season, then go on the road. North Dakota gets a good win at Bemidji State. Then the Beavers come in last Saturday night and end up with an overtime victory. Do you feel like this team is, was that expectation with, 3-1? I mean, I'm sure 4-0 feels good, but 3-1, when you look at the roster teams, Bemidji's a tough team. Everybody knew that.
Yeah, I think they're a team that is certainly going to contend for an NCAA spot this year. To the year the pandemic shut everything down, Bemidji State would have been an at-large team that year. Then they come back the next year and they're an at-large team and really manhandled Wisconsin in that first NCAA tournament game. Now they come back and they have like 22 players from their roster last year. They did lose a couple key players, but still, that's a lot of experienced guys coming back for the Beavers. So I think they're pretty good. UND gets a split of that weekend. Pairwise, better than a split because the loss was in overtime. So, overall a pretty good start. But if you look at their schedule, it's tough. especially just look at the non-conference. They've got Quinnipiac coming up. I think they're probably the best team in the ECAC. Maybe the best team out east, period. Then, they've got Minnesota in non-conference. They're, one of the top teams in the country, preseason Big Ten favorites. They've got Cornell. They're one of the best teams in the ECAC. So on top of their really difficult NCHC schedule, which I think the NCHC is going to be pretty good this year. I mean, their non-conference it's not easy. So we'll find out quite a bit about this team in a hurry, beginning this weekend, obviously.
You didn't even have to mention Penn State, which will be a fun game down in Nashville.
Yeah, in Nashville. Yeah.
Tell me something about some of these players. I'm looking at like Ashton Calder with 4 goals already in the season. Jake Schmaltz with 3 in 4 games. Where do you see the offense coming from this year?
I think that was the question coming in. Especially when you lose essentially your top 2 lines. Last year, they had Colin Adams, Jordan Kawaguchi, and Grant Mismash was their top line. All 3 of those guys signed NHL deals. You've got Shane Pinto. He signs an NHL deal. You've got Jasper Weatherby. He signs an NHL deal. On defense, their top pairing, Kierstad and Bernard Docker, both signed NHL deals. So you kind of wonder, where's the offense going to come from this year? They needed the transfers to add a little bit. I don't think you can ask all this to be carried by freshmen. You need your returners to take a step. But Calder's a guy who scored a lot for Lake Superior State. He's got a great shot. He can finish. And so far, he's scored 4 goals in 4 games here. And he's looked really good. I think Connor Ford's a guy who's going to help him right away. He had 100 points in his career at Bowling Green. He's a really good 200-foot guy. I think he's going to add some offense as far as a newcomer. Jake Schmaltz is a guy who you don't often see guys play 2 years of junior after they were taken in the NHL draft. And I think Jake Schmaltz is a guy who really was patient with his development. He didn't panic and say, "Man, all these other guys who were drafted around me are in college. I need to go. He was really patient, and he had a great year in the USHL. And I think you're seeing the benefits of his patience in his development this year. And then the two returners, I think, who are going to be really big for them offensively are Reese Gaber and Judd Caulfield. Gaber is one of the most explosive players in the league. USHL MVP 2 years ago. He's a guy that can generate offense on his own. And Judd Caulfield, a completely different player. He's a big power forward, extremely strong, powerful guy, great vision. And he showed what he can do with his shot Friday night in Bemidji 2 with a really nice goal that gave North Dakota a 4-2 lead. And because Bemidji scored an extra attacker goal, they needed that one. So I think those are kind of the guys that they're going to rely on to produce offense. And of course, on the back end, Jake Sanderson is, if he's not the best player in college hockey, he's right there. I mean, he's as good of a player as I've seen at North Dakota in 17 years. He's exceptional.
Ed and I laughed about it a little bit with Derek Schooley on Monday's podcast. Zach Driscoll goes back to North Dakota on Friday night. Obviously, he was a great player at Bemidji, and now goes into Bemidji as a North Dakota player. Gets booed by the crowd in net for North Dakota, but could he be a really good stabilizing factor for this Fighting Hawks team?
I think so. He's been around for a long time. He's been in a lot of different situations. He's a guy who got that NCAA tournament experience last year. He was in net for the Beavers when they beat Cole Caulfield, Dylan Holloway, and that explosive Badger team. He's seen a lot. So that's why I think he's able to go into Bemidji and handle that. What had to be a really tough game for him. That's his old home. And but yeah, I think he's a guy that can handle a lot of different situations just because he's been around And obviously he's good at what he does. But, I think maturity helps too in that position.
We've talked about transfers for North Dakota. Quinnipiac picked up a couple of key players in this, in net, Dylan St. Cyr, and then a guy with a national championship ring, Oliver Chow. What are you looking for from Quinnipiac matching up against the Fighting Hawks?
Yeah, you look at their roster, and it seems like it's all juniors, seniors, and fifth-year players. I was going through the roster. I'm like, do they have freshmen and sophomores there this year? They've got a couple, but not many. One of their underclassmen is Ty Smolanek, who's obviously extremely skilled and was a great player at the NTDP. And I'm fairly certain North Dakota recruited him and wanted him to come to Grand Forks. They were already going to have a really good team and a really veteran team. And then I think they mixed in some of these transfers. And, I talked to one of their players yesterday, Marcus Chorney, a defenseman. His brother and father both played for North Dakota and were all Americans. And Marcus said that there's some credibility in the locker room with Oliver Chow. He knows what it takes to win a national championship. He's been there. And so I think he carries with him that experience and certainly has the attention of the Quinnipiac players who believe that they can win a national championship this year. And then, Dylan St. Cyr is a veteran guy. He's been at Notre Dame. Another transfer they picked up that North Dakota is going to be very familiar with is Griffin Mendel, the defenseman from Denver. North Dakota and Denver played 7 times in the last season. So they know Griffin Mendel real well. They really mixed in some good transfers with some really, really good returners. And they've got some defensive defensemen, offensive guys. They can score. It looks like they've got 2 goaltenders that can play. So, there's not a lot of weaknesses there.
While we're on the topic of transfers, you did everybody a great service and probably got a lot of clicks for your newspaper by keeping a list of transfers throughout the summer. I think your number that you came up with is 154 D1 transfers. Do you have a sense of whether this, we see how it's benefited the 2 teams playing this weekend, but do you have a sense of how this is for the game? How is this affecting college hockey? Is it good, bad?
I think it's too early to know all the effects of it. I think it's going to change over time. Right now, the first thing I'll say is about the explosion of players in the transfer portal is most of the guys that go in, the vast majority are just guys that aren't playing. I think a lot of people have this perception that everyone's jumping in there trying to find the grass is greener on the other side. No, most of them, it isn't working out where they're at. And maybe they were told by their coach, you know what, this ain't working. You're not going to play next year. And some of them maybe want to go to D3, so I would say that's part of it. Number 2, fact that all the players who were played last year got that free year. So now all of a sudden you have seniors that can come back. That cycle is going to last 3 more years. And I think for those 3 years, you're going to see a lot of players in the portal. Some of these seniors who are going to the portal, they're not all players who are looking to jump ship. Some of them, their coach said, hey, look, we have promised freshmen these spots. We would love to have you back, but what do? We and so that's where a guy like Griffin Mendel ends up at Quinnipiac. Would Denver like to have Griffin Mendel? Sure. But they don't want to give up Sean Behrens or Shai Buyam, who are coming in and freshmen who are going to be there for 4 more years to have 1 year of Mendel. So decisions have to be made. And then the other thing that's going to complicate things is for 1 season, everyone gets to go over their 18 scholarship limit. So, I know like in the NCHC, St. Cloud State and Minnesota Duluth, they're over 18 scholarships this year. They brought back 5 or 6 fifth-year seniors, and then they were able to bring in some freshmen, and they were able to go over. Now, the next 3 years, you can't go over. So now some really tough decisions are going to have to be made. Which seniors do you bring back? Freshmen coming in. So we might even see more players in the portal the next 3 years, because some of these seniors who they say, hey, look, we don't have room for you. And these seniors are going to say, well, I love playing college hockey. I want to go play some more. I'm going to jump in the portal and see if anyone wants to have me play there. So I think the next 3 years, we're going to see a lot of players in the portal. After that, I think it's going to drop off quite a bit because now you don't have that free COVID year anymore. And it'll still be higher because you have that one-time transfer rule, but time will tell exactly how it works out. And, I'm not sure yet after, a month, I have a clear view of how it's worked out.
It may be just perception on my part, but I think it's probably accurate that Western teams coming east doesn't seem to happen as often as a lot of people would like. This weekend, you've got Denver with a great series going into Providence and BC. And then North Dakota, as you noted on your Twitter account, just the second time in an ECAC barn in 10 years. Do you think this is a new trend? Are teams willing to travel a bit more?
That's a good question. It feels early this season that we've had more of it, though. I mean, you think of how many marquee non-conference games there have already been, and some really awesome games this early in the year. And I was just thinking to myself, I don't remember there being this many great non-conference games this early in the year. And, I wouldn't be surprised if you see teams coming east a little bit more of it. Just from North Dakota, speaking from their spot, I know they're going to be going out to Cornell here in a year or two. They were actually supposed to go out to Cornell last season, but obviously that didn't happen. So they'll be going there. It'll be interesting to see where it goes from there. But I know they've talked about it here, and they're playing at Quinnipiac. They're playing at Cornell. We'll see where else they go. But I remember after they played Union, it would have been 2016 New Year's Eve. Remember, Brad Berry loved that game. He thought it was great. And on the plane ride home, he was, brainstorming where else they could go out east at some point. So it appears that Quinnipiac and Cornell were the two that came up, and we'll see where else.
Well, certainly a classic barn at Lina Rink and a brand new, fairly new facility for Quinnipiac. I guess the other bonus in that is you get to visit some more cities and sample some cuisine. I understand you're going to be introduced to New Haven, which is kind of an enclave of great pizza. So we look forward to hearing your year-end report on that.
Absolutely. And I didn't even know until this week that was like the thing there. Like everyone's been telling me like, oh man, you get to have New Haven pizza this weekend. I'm like, I'd never heard that before. And I don't know how I haven't heard that before, but it should be fun. And then, I think it's from a competition standpoint, I think some of these teams like getting out and seeing the different leagues, different teams. And, it's really an opportunity to boost your pairwise. North Dakota is playing on the road at a team that's probably going to be top 5 at the end of the year. This is a really good chance for North Dakota to, get some points pairwise value this weekend if they have a good weekend. So I think that's something coaches have to look at too when they schedule some of these. So I think that might be part of it too.
The pizza can be a little bit expensive, as can be the Uber ride from Quinnipiac's campus down to Worcester Street. Worcester, said Worcester, spelled Wooster, so don't get confused right there. Before I let you go, give me one thing that you think for this North Dakota team this year has to stand out, has to be kind of the difference maker.
I think they need to find enough offense. I think their D-core is really good. I think they can match up that D-core with, especially their top 4. That top 4 is as good as, you'll find, with Jake Sanderson, Ethan Frisch, Tyler Clevin, and Chris Jandrick. I think that's a really, really good top 4. But, the question is, are they going to have those nights where the puck doesn't go in? We'll see. They haven't had one of those nights yet, but I think that's the question mark. How much, when you lose all those guys, you don't just replace them. You don't just say, okay, here's, those guys were really good for a reason. So I think if they're able to get enough offense this season, they are going to be right back in the mix. So I think that's what I'm watching. Can they generate enough? So far they have, but their schedule is going to be pretty hard.
Well, in terms of an East-West series, I don't know that we're going to get any better this year than North Dakota Quinnipiac, and that'll be taking place this weekend. Brad Schlossman, Grand Forks Herald, we appreciate everything you do. You do such a good job covering this game for the college hockey world. So hats off to you. We will continue to read your coverage, and thanks for taking the time to join us today.
Yeah, I appreciate it, guys. Thanks for having me on.
That's Brad Schlossman of the Grand Forks Herald talking about North Dakota at Quinnipiac. We'll look at that game and some other big matchups this weekend when the USCHO Game of the Week podcast continues.
This is the USCHO Game of the Week podcast from US College Hockey Online.
Welcome back to the USCHO Game of the Week podcast. I'm Ed Trefzger alongside Jim Connelly. Jim, why don't we start out with the series that we talked about with Brad Schlossman, and that is number 6 North Dakota at number 7 Quinnipiac, a 2-game series in Hamden, Connecticut. It should be some terrific hockey. And I think that the team that is really going to prove something this weekend is Quinnipiac.
That's quite possible. I'm impressed by what we've seen from the Bobcats thus far. I thought they were great against Boston College. The first night of the icebreaker, they played really well the next day against Northeastern, get a shutout. Then they go up to Burlington, Vermont, get another shutout there. 2 different goalies going. I'm not sure. I assume we're probably going to see Dylan St. Cyr this weekend. That's, from what Rand Pecknall told me, that's his starting goaltender. He was injured the first weekend for the icebreaker, didn't play. But I think that, maybe there is something to prove, certainly for Quinnipiac. But you heard Brad mention it. And, for either team, and I know it's probably bigger for North Dakota because they're on the road. In terms of pairwise, this is a huge weekend. If either team sweeps this weekend, those are pairwise points that you're banking. And those are quality win bonuses. These 2 teams are going to be anywhere from 1 to 10, 1 to 9 in the RPI at the end of the season. So these are really strong wins. These are wins, real high quality wins that you want to get. So if you can find a way to sweep or take 5 or 6 points, if you need an overtime in there, high quality win bonus is very much in play for both of these games this weekend.
And perhaps more to gain for Quinnipiac because the overall non-conference winning percentage of the NCHC is no doubt going to be better than the ECAC. And with that, the Bobcats really pick up a big boost. I think right off the bat on Friday, you're going to tell what kind of a game it's going to be. I'm thinking about last year when Quinnipiac was able to get the games in against Bowling Green. And Quinnipiac didn't really play its game that well, that really attacking in-your-face style that Rand Pecknold wants to have. And if they're not able to come out with that, then it's going to be a tougher night for the Bobcats. And as Brad was saying, North Dakota is still trying to figure out things offensively. We'll have to see how that goes right from the start, too.
Well, let's understand one thing first. Playing North Dakota is going to be a little different than playing Bowling Green, and that's no disrespect to Bowling Green. There is some excitement, I'm sure, for Quinnipiac to be able to host North Dakota for 2 games in Hampton. And that's just a reality. You don't get North Dakota has not come east to play in too many buildings in the last decade. And, to have this team there, that will be excitement enough. That should give them the spark early in the game. If it doesn't, there's a problem. But I would expect to see that Quinnipiac offense, going back to some of their Frozen Four teams that explodes early, forechecks hard early, maybe finds ways to score some greasy, dirty goals early. That's what they do. I mean, that's what makes them, in my opinion, a solid team. It's not usually that they get flashy plays. This is a team that knows how to work hard for goals. And, the reality is, I think that's probably the characteristic that probably stands out about this North Dakota team too. They've lost, Kawaguchi and Mishmash and some of these other really talented forwards, and they've got to have some guys filling some holes. And I bet that a lot of their play might be a little greasier than usual. There's not going to be style points out there for the Fighting Hawks or the Bobcats. So I look at this as kind of more of a workman-like game than we might have thought of either one of these teams in the past. I think that's where the entertainment factor comes in.
Well, let's stick with some games happening in the East. Another East-West matchup. Number 8 Denver comes in to take on number 12 Providence on Friday and number 10 BC on Saturday. This Denver team, I expect to really recover from last year's drought and maybe be battling for a top 5 by the end of the season.
Really good start too. 4-0 out of the gate. I like things that we've seen thus far. Now this will be an interesting weekend. They're going to go face a Providence team that has to be hungry because they played well at as we call it, a stacked icebreaker tournament. 4 teams all in the top 10. They were the lowest team of all of them, and they're a pretty good hockey team, Providence. So I think there'll be some hunger from Providence's end. Whether that translates onto the ice, I think sometimes home ice has been kind to them. Sometimes they get some slow starts on home ice, and I don't know if they can afford that against Denver. Then the second night for Denver, going to Boston College, and BC coming off that loss to Bentley. They're going to get Colorado College first on Friday night. And sorry, Colorado College. I think you're going to run into a buzzsaw. That's just reality. But then what happens on night 2? And can BC put together back-to-back great games? Because they haven't done that. They went into the icebreaker and had a very good game against Quinnipiac, but not a solid game. And then the second night against Holy Cross, they weren't tested. And maybe they were a good team that night. They got off to an early lead and then just kind of, treaded water. Oh, and then last weekend, obviously a good win on Friday, a bad loss on Saturday. And, how do you balance all of that off for BC? Who are they? Can they put together 2 consecutive great games? And that's what they're going to need, I think, against both Colorado College and Denver. And if BC can, then it could be a long weekend out here for Denver, but go to the other side. Denver comes out, plays the hockey they want to play both nights. Could they be 6-0 at the end of this weekend? If they are, they're going to take 2 really quality road wins with them.
And those are huge implications for the pairwise for them as well, because Providence and Boston College will be in the hunt for the NCAAs most certainly.
No doubt. I mean, these are quality win bonuses. I mean, that's what North Dakota and Denver are really have to be thinking way back in their head. And I know we shouldn't talk about the pairwise in October, but you don't get to play these games in March. So you can only win those quality win bonuses against non-conference teams early in the season. These are the ones that you're going to have to think about when the season comes to an end.
Let's go to the West. Number 5 Minnesota Duluth at number 4 Minnesota. Boy, this one feels to me like a toss-up. Minnesota Duluth in the icebreaker last weekend got thumped by Michigan after dominating the Wolverines earlier in the game, but they also lost Noah Cates in that game with an ejection. Minnesota had a split with St. Cloud. Still trying to figure out actually how I assess them. I think this is anybody's game. Yeah,
I think it's which identity gets to be played toward. Is this a blue collar game? Is this a rough and tumble game, or is this a high flying game with a lot of track meet style to it? If it's a track meet game, it's Minnesota's game. If it's more of kind of a hard fought, heavy game played along the walls, I think that Duluth has a lot of advantage there. But at the end of the day, these games will be big in the overall kind of scope of things. These are good opponents playing one another, in-state rivals, kind of. I know that they're not in the same conference anymore, but it still feels like a rivalry. And I think that there has to be some hunger for both teams to get to play each other. I think that you're going to see a rough series. I don't think this is actually going to be that flashy track meet style series. I think this is going to play a little bit more toward Duluth's identity. And I don't know if that means wins, but it's certainly this is going to be a series that's going to be a little heavier than just a typical 2-game series would be.
Speaking of non-league intrastate matchups, two unbeaten teams from Michigan, number 17 Western Michigan and number 1 Michigan. First-year head coach Pat Ferschweiler has an unbeaten record going in, but he's going to be up against a buzzsaw as he actually late in the offseason took over when Andy Murray retired. This is going to be a tough one for Western, and for Michigan, this is one they can't afford to slip up with.
No, don't get caught watching the paint dry, and that's one of the dangerous things here is that there's a good team in that Western Michigan locker room. And if Michigan does not take them seriously, they will lose. But should this be a series that Michigan comes out of it with 2 wins? Absolutely. I think that the quality of Michigan right now, and it's not just their power play, because we've talked about their power play a lot. It's all around. They have plenty of scoring. They're getting good goaltending from Portillo right now. I think that Michigan should be able to take care of business here, but these are the ones that I think, as if I was a coach, these are the games that kind of give me a little bit of heartburn, because you don't know that your team will necessarily. I mean, you're coming off an icebreaker tournament where you knew you were going to play 2 really high quality opponents, whoever it was going to be, whether it was going to be number 5 and number 1 or number whatever it was. I can't remember who matched up against who, but you were going to play really solid teams, and you knew you were going to have 2 games against top 10 opponents. This is still a nationally ranked team in Western Michigan, and this is still a really high quality team. So if Mel Pearson's squad's not ready, they could get thumped. That's a caution warning kind of that they have to take.
Well, Jim, you'll handicap the games we talked about in our weekly, for entertainment purposes only, USCHO Bettor's Edge column, and you get to see how the 10 Division I columnists pick the games that we just talked about. That's been kind of fun to put that together, and also fun to see how everybody does each week.
Yeah, I realize that I'm not as good at handicapping games as some other people, and I'll hopefully get a little bit better. I think I tend to want to always go for the long shot. And thus far in the season, the long shots haven't come in that much. So it's interesting to look at this week after week. And again, it's entertainment purposes only. But if you can find a bookie out there that'll take your bets, then hopefully you take some advice.
Well, it might be fun more than just the picks, just to see how everybody does against the money line at some point. But that's a whole lot of mathematics.
It is. I am good at math, and there are really, really good computer formulas that can do that. But that would take a lot more time than I have.
That wouldn't be entertaining. And this is, of course, for entertainment purposes only. Well, that's it for this week's USCHO Game of the Week podcast. For Jim Connelly, I'm Ed Trefzger, and we'll catch you next time.
This has been the USCHO Game of the Week podcast, a production of U.S. College Hockey Online. Visit uscho.com/podcasts to listen or subscribe.